Sí, creo que sí. Hola, buenos días. Por favor, vayan.
Good morning, everyone. Please take your seats. We will begin our meeting.
Vamos a dar comienzo la reunión de la Comisión.
Let's begin the Sustainable Development and Environment and Environmental Research and Technology in our EuroLat committee. We've got Arlindo Chinaya co-chairing, who's from Brazil, and myself from the European Parliament chairing the meeting today. I thank you all for being present today. We are running a little bit late. We started a bit late and we must finish on time at 1:30. So let us make good use of the time available to us. I also wish to thank our guests who are here today and who will be speaking later. Ms. Christine Lang, Olga Vaus, Mr. Vasquez, and Mr. Alvaro del Blanco. I wish to thank all of them for being here with us today. And also, let me thank the diplomatic services of the European Union and others present in the room today. Can I also welcome the representatives of the Economic and Social Committee who are present here in their capacity as permanent observers. Now, since we are meeting on European soil, no sound for the speaker, the European side will be hosting. We have interpretation today from Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, and into all those languages. We also have passive provision of interpretation for Italian, so you may speak Italian. The meeting will be streamed online, will be recorded, and the internet streamed version will be made available on our intranet site. So having made these introductory remarks, can I open up the first item on the agenda? First of all, the adoption of the draft agenda, which you will have received. It was sent out to all members. Are there any comments? This does not seem to be the case, so we can deem the agenda adopted. The next item is the adoption and approval of the minutes of our previous meeting, which was held in Brussels on the 1st of December last. You will have received a copy of the draft minutes. Are there any comments? Any comments on the minutes? This does not seem to be the case. Anyway, you can send in any proposed changes, and those need to be sent in to the Secretariat by email before 10 a.m. tomorrow. Failure, in the absence of any comments, the minutes will be deemed adopted. Let's move on now to the third item. Co-chairman's announcements. And I now give the floor to Mr. Chinaya.
Vou falar aqui a respeito do nosso tempo como...
Thank you very much. Jordi has already said we only have 2 hours for today's meeting, so we'll have to be very disciplined. So the proposal is as follows. Given that we are limited in terms of our time and we need to have an efficient debate, can I suggest the following for timekeeping? No more than 10 minutes for the initial presentation, and no more than 3 minutes for the wrap-up conclusions of our guest speakers, and we are very grateful to them for being here today and welcome them. Maximum 2 minutes for the speakers who come in. I know this is not a great deal of time, but this is all we can allow for. Now, it isn't a lot of time, but given we do have interpretation, and it's important to allow the interpreters to interpret your words and for your words to be translated. And in order for this to happen, we do need to stick to the meeting times. And all the items on our agenda do need to be covered. So with this in mind, can I suggest that when we give the floor to you, we all stick very strictly to the speaking time. Now, if we see that there is any further slack, then we can certainly discuss increasing the speaking time if time allows. But we must all be very strict in keeping to no more than 2 minutes speaking time. Is anyone wishing to object to this proposal? Well, if there is no objection, then we can approve this working method. There's another further statement I'd like to make, a further point I'd like to raise. This is a very important time to be holding a EuroLat meeting. It's right after the summit of the European Union and the Organization of Latin American and Central American States. And the purpose of the summit was to bring both regions closer to one another, and it's a window of opportunity for renewed cooperation between our peoples. Can I also recall that paragraph 34 of the closing declaration of the summit stresses the importance of parliamentary cooperation and it highlights the key role of our assembly in this regard. Can I now give the floor back to the co-president, Jordi Soler? Co-president, thank you very much. As you know, today's meeting, committee meeting, will be focusing on a debate. We felt it was important to just focus on one topic, the following. The title reads, Overcoming Fiscal Challenges in Times of Crisis, Successful Alternatives for the Implementation of the Green Transition. Now, we all believe and understand that this topic deserves to be discussed in some detail. We have 1.5 hours, but I'm sure that we will hold interesting and stimulating debates. A transition towards a more green and sustainable future is an urgent imperative, and the traditional models for fiscal adjustment are proving to be proving insufficient when it comes to adapting to the new reality. This is why we have to rethink the models that exist and adopt more integrated and holistic approaches that will be favorable to achieving a green transition. A green transition should not be seen primarily as an economic burden, but on the contrary, should be seen as an opportunity for stimulating sustainable growth and innovation. Furthermore, it's essential that we consider social justice aspects when we consider all the alternatives. Fiscal models need to be developed in such a way as to ensure that we are not overly burdening the more vulnerable groups in our society, and that we can forge a just and equitable transition that leaves no one behind. Right now, the green transition is perpetuating a vicious circle. Austerity measures that often have been imposed in the name of economic stability bring about cuts to public services, essential services, which disproportionately impact the most vulnerable sections of society. The green transition is an opportunity to promote sustainable development, to create green jobs and stimulate innovation. We need to look for equitable distribution when it comes to the tax burden and becoming less reliant on fossil fuels, and introduce taxation on the surplus revenue of big multinational companies in times of crisis, or a minimum 15% tax rate for multinationals, and a number of other measures that have been tabled in recent times. We need to recognize that the health of our planet is at stake here, and the survival of future generations will depend on the actions that we take today. Not tomorrow, but today. A green transition is not just an action or an optional point. It's a moral and environmental imperative. The time to act is now, before it is too late. And so the experts that we have invited today will help us to identify the main challenges that we face in our societies today. And I very much hope that they will also suggest some of the best possible responses that we can take in our parliaments to better counter these challenges. Thank you very much indeed to each and every one of you for having accepted the invitation to participate in our meeting today. As Co-President Chinaya said, you will have the floor now to make a presentation for no more than 10 minutes. I'll just briefly introduce you before giving you the floor. First of all, we have Christine Lang, who's head of the Public Sector Division of Latin America and Caribbean Bank of the European Bank of Investments, EIB. We have Olga Bauskibert from INTPA B2 of the European Commission, unit dealing with Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean. We've got Juan Vasquez, who is from the OECD, dealing with the Caribbean and Central American development. And we have Alvaro del Blanco from the Fiscal Institute of Spain. Can I first now give the floor to our speakers in the established order? So first of all, let us begin with hearing from Christine Lang for her presentation. I'd like to begin by thanking this Parliamentary Assembly for the invitation, for giving us a chance to speak on green development and the green transition. I thank both co-presidents for the invitation. I'd like to speak about three things: the Global Investment Bank and the Global Gateway. That's one thing I want to talk about. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the green transition that's not just green, but also just. And finally, I'd like to give you a few pointers for the future.
Activities in the region, the EIB has been active with over 15 billion in contributions of projects. Just last year, we contributed 1.5 billion in contracts that were signed related to the Global Gateway Investment Agenda. We are already contributing to the Global Gateway Investment Agenda in an active manner. Olga will go into more details about the Global Gateway Investment Agenda, but we have analyzed the current list of projects, and we are involved in 21 out of the 112 projects. These are projects where we already started the due diligence. It doesn't mean that future projects will not enter our due diligence process, but we are already looking at or already have signed. In fact, we have already signed 1.3 billion in projects contributing to the Global Gateway Investment Agenda. We also have in our pipeline over 3 billion and additional signatures on the way. So we are working to contribute. And how are we contributing? I'm wearing green. I'm wearing green for a reason, because what we do in Latin America and the Caribbean is green. 75% of what we signed last year was either climate action or environmental sustainability. This includes water and sanitation, a very important area that's often overlooked in the region, energy, For example, we're financing the interconnector between Ecuador and Peru, transmission lines in Argentina, and renewable energy in Brazil. Furthermore, we're active in what is called the Team Europe initiative, which is together with the Chilean government, the delegation in Chile developed the Team Europe initiative for green hydrogen, and we're working there with KfW on that endeavor. So with this Team Europe approach, we try to work together. Within the Commission, you have EuroClima, which is actively engaging at the policy level. So when you speak about the NDCs, which are the mitigation actions that the countries are going to take, they're also working on the adaptation plans, discussing with the civil society and bringing in those elements. Then we get down to the delegations where they develop the Team Europe initiatives, where we try to actively contribute with other member states. I'll just give an example. We have the City Gap Fund, which has pre-feasibility studies, which is extremely important. Municipalities, they need this extra grant of technical assistance to be able to decide whether something can go forward. Then you also have the Felicity program, which is helping also the municipalities in energy efficiency measures. And GIZ, who is very active in the water and sanitation areas. But it's essential to have the project preparation. It's not just an issue of finance, it's an issue of having the projects that are bankable and ready to be financed. Now, when we talk about sustainable projects, I think it's important to go over the whole gamut of products that we have and how we contribute. First of all, on the public side, when a government is going to be financing, you have a choice. You could either issue a bond, or you could have a loan with an entity like the EIB. As the EIB is AAA rated, we pass on the funding benefit to our clients. So normally the cost of a loan via the EIB, which could benefit from up to 30 years tenor with a grace period, will make it more attractive from a physical point of view. We also, for the public sector projects, have something Olga will probably talk about, which is called LACIF, which has technical assistance and grant elements to support projects, and we have it approved for the water and sanitation program for the Caribbean. But it's important to think about crowding in private sector investment. You have to have an enabling environment for the private sector to open up their pocketbooks, because this is how you're going to finance, in particular, the green transition. We work through intermediate lending, which could be through a public sector development bank or a private sector bank. We've signed recently 500 million in Brazil for solar panels, also with Banco Estado for energy efficient housing. But it's not just through the banks that one can have an impact, it's also through funds. So we have made an equity investment in the Global Gateway Fund and the Latin America Energy Efficient Housing Fund. And lastly, we finance companies like Neoenergia and Enel. I just want to stress the issue of just, because when we talk about the just transition, we're talking about mitigation. And I just want to give two examples of two companies in Brazil and how they are, in my view, contributing to the just. In 2019, Neoenergia decided that they were going to start a school to train female electricians. There were 120 vacancies, 15,000 applications, 15,000 applications, huge demand. And since then, Neoenergia has really developed, they've evolved now. 30% of all the positions in the electrician school are for women. The first people who had to take the test, they had to climb up these poles and throw the ball, but the gloves were too big and their boots were too long, but they succeeded. So Neoenergia had to change, the manner in which they were, buying the equipment and the uniforms. If you see me afterwards, I can show you some pictures of these very proud women who, it's really transcended their social interactions. Their perspective has completely been changed by this element. Another example is in the favelas in São Paulo, where Enel came up with this project where they were trying to address energy losses, but they also thought about the social aspect with the social energy tariff. Now, why would someone want to give up, you think about the poles with all the wires, I think we've all seen that before. Why would someone want to give up their free access and suddenly have to pay something? Well, they created this social tariff, which made it affordable. And guess what? If you get an energy bill, you have an address. And if you have an address, you can register your land, and you can get Social Security, and you can even open a bank account. And they have discovered that most of the beneficiaries were women in these favelas. So it just brings in the social aspect. Now, in terms of actions, you've seen how in Brazil they are taking action with the company level, but also at the parliamentarian area, you can make a difference. And I'm going to give two examples. One is in the water and sanitation sector, where they published a law in 2020 that creates the basic sanitation legal framework for the universalization of water and sanitation by 2033. Ambitious. They wanted 99% of the population to have access to potable water and 90% to sewage and treatment. This is resulting in investment. We are seeing demand from all the different entities in Brazil to accompany this change. Another example relates to solar panels. So in 2022, they created a legal framework in Brazil for micro and mini generation. And I just ask you, do you have this framework in your countries? They also created a system where if you requested the access by the 6th of January of this year, you would also have a free solar tax in 2045. Also, they created in March of this year an abolishment of federal taxes on solar panels to encourage clean energy adoption, and this is until 2026. So this is an example of how they are actually trying to influence the behavior of individuals, and it's working. So I congratulate them on that. We talked about just transition and the elements of trying to see in the mitigation area, but I just want to close by talking about just resilience, because I think too much we forget about adaptation. Climate change is impacting people in different ways, and different locations are suffering more than others. And so we also need to think about how we can accompany and help these populations. Often it could mean that you're using intermediate lending to help them from a microfinance area, help these people adjust. But just please don't forget that this element is important. The EIB is here to be a partner to help you make a difference, and I look forward to further discussion. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señora Lang, por su intervención. Y seguidamente paso la...
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Lang, for your presentation. I now give the floor to Olga Baus for 10 minutes.
Gracias. Gracias, presidentes.
Thank you very much indeed. Honourable members, it's a great honour for me to be here with you today. It's only 1 week since the leaders of our regions met in the select context to take forward our relationships substantially at a bi-regional level. A lot of very important decisions were taken, and the Global Gateway agenda was no exception. The strategy for the Global Gateway is the main focus of my remarks to you this morning. In point of fact, the Global Gateway strategy was adopted about 1 year ago, and it's an investment agenda. Essentially, the idea is that it will serve to implement the strategy in a pragmatic way by generating investment on the ground. Our economic models need to develop, and they need to do this quickly if we really want to have an impact in some of these extremely important issues, such as tackling inequality and climate change. We need to re-industrialize. We need to reduce the asymmetric dependencies that there are in strategic sectors, which we saw very clearly through the Russian aggression in Ukraine and the COVID crisis. We need to establish value chains which are sustainable. And that is really what the Global Gateway investment agenda seeks to do. Clearly, it is additional to overseas development aid, which in and of itself is not sufficient to drive the level of change necessary, although it's very important. And so together with that, we want to achieve qualitative investments by leveraging private sector investment. And this is what we feel will enable us to make rapid progress in the green transition, which my colleague talked about a moment ago. So this is what the Global Gateway really seeks to do: establish alliances, establish cooperation, collaboration across the public-private sectors. We have a number of objectives which are essentially governed by the digital and green transitions and digital inclusion, as we've heard already this morning. So we're trying to promote investment in key sectors such as energy, transport, research, health, and the digital sector. So how are we actually doing this in practice? How is the agenda on investment actually focused, and what is the strategy? More than 30 projects have been identified hitherto. This has been over the course of the past 6 months in conjunction with governments at bilateral level, with banks at an individual level. And the banks are actually one of Team Europe's important members, but also the EIB, the CAF, the Caribbean Development Bank, and the individual member states. And when I talk about member states, of course, I'm talking about the cooperation agencies and the ministries. And we've been working very intensively with them. This has taken place not least in the context of the Spanish presidency, which has now begun. We've been talking about these projects in a number of different fora, not least the forum with civil society and local authorities, which took place before the actual summit. And we find is a very important instrument in promoting inclusivity in the development of the and rollout of the project. So these 30 projects are going to deliver many opportunities for close cooperation across this alliance, and we hope it's going to drive forward bi-regional cooperation. It's founded on political commitment, and it brings together development cooperation, grant financing, which comes from the EIB and other banks, and also grants and assistance, which comes from other sources, for example, foreign investment, FDI, and also private investment. The Commission President von der Leyen committed the European Union to 45 billion investment to deliver over 5 years on this investment commitment. Now, this is a substantial amount of money which has been committed by Team Europe, but it's not just Team Europe that will be funding it. There will also be grants which are given through the European Union's budget, and it encompasses also a number of credits which will be funded by the European Investment Bank in conjunction with European development banks. It also will provide guarantees based on the European budget and additional funding and support which member states give for export credits. So the European Union is, of course, the biggest investor in Latin America. At the end of 2021, direct FDI in Latin America and the Caribbean was 700 billion. And so this is a very strong basis on which to develop our new future-orientated strategy, which will focus on quality investment, on close links with the powerful private sector, and on crowding in private investment. That is what we aspire to achieve. Of course, the list that I've given you hitherto is not exhaustive. It's a dynamic list, an open-ended list, which will be adjusted according to the specific needs of the Latin American and Caribbean states, and according to the specific needs of the citizens and societies. We're including some of the initiatives that were recommended by local authorities and civil society at our pre-meeting the week before last, and this we will continue to do on an ongoing basis as part of our working method. I'm not sure whether it's been possible for any of you to see the infographics that we've put together. These give illustrations of the 130 projects which are on the list. You can, if you access the web, you can see it. You can see what we're doing in terms of the green transition, and many of the projects are going to be an important contribution there. There are a number of projects, for example, on energy transition. In the summit, 3 important memoranda of understanding were signed with Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay. And these were specifically on green hydrogen and renewables. So the investment in these sectors will be, we hope, an initial investment which will grow rapidly and leverage in a lot of additional money. There will, of course, be investment in primary resources and in critical raw materials, and many discussions are still ongoing. There are memoranda of understanding being negotiated as we speak with these countries and with others too. The hope being that it will be possible to establish sustainable value chains going forward. There are many projects too which will deliver on the target for decarbonisation. This is part of the political objectives established by the EU in the context of Fit for 55, which encompasses a lot of renewables, but also a lot of smart mobility technology, such as electric buses, electric trains, and so forth. I'd like to conclude my few remarks by just flagging up 2 things that I think are absolutely key here. One is the need to crowd in private investment. The involvement of the private sector has got to be more extensive. I've had initial discussions with a number of representatives. This was prior to the summit. On the Monday morning, I met a number of participants from different panels in order to have some initial talks with them. And that was very helpful because it enabled us to identify some challenges which presented themselves for the private sector and also some ways in which we could promote public-private partnerships. More widely, within the more general context of the Global Gateway, we intend to establish a consultative committee, and this will bring on board industry, and so we will have experts who are able to give us their analysis of how the Global Gateway is actually delivering. In order to attract more private sector investment, the EU has been working with individual countries to get this off the ground. I've referred to it already, and we have this global initiative of green bonds, which is part of the investment initiative. There are 7 in these 130 projects, which the member states have focused on as initial priority projects, the intention being that they will improve the financial ecosystem and also will be based on the taxonomy criteria. So the green bonds will be a means of funding green infrastructural development, which is so important for the green transition. Then the second thing that I wanted to flag up was the fact that each project obviously ties in with the social agenda. This is where the European Union is able to generate added value over and above what other global players can do. The investment goes into infrastructure based on a very wide range of individual projects. The idea is not just to invest in infrastructure, but also to promote productivity and initiatives at local level. So it's to enhance innovation and education, for example, to develop creative capacities at more local level, to build on small initiatives that are already there, which are so beneficial to the most vulnerable populations in society. So this is a big priority. And the social and economic and environmental standards which underpin this are vital. There's also, of course, regulatory initiatives, because that too is a further aspect of the policy making which has to be in place. But I think I'll leave it at that for just now. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. That was very interesting and very helpful, and you also stuck absolutely to your 10-minute speaking time, so thank you very much indeed. The next speaker is going to be Mr. Juan Vasquez, so you have the floor, sir.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you. On behalf of the OECD and the Development Center that I'm representing today, I do have a presentation which I believe will be put up on screen. It's in English, but I will be making my comments in Spanish. I do hope it's not too tense, and I may skip over some of the slides so that we have enough time for questions as well. Now, before I could get into the substance of the issue at stake today, which I think is crucial to the work that we're doing here in our OECD Development Center, let me just briefly mention some of the work that we've done in the past. I think it's important for you to have this background information, and also some of the data and work that's being done is publicly available for you to consult. Now, I'd like to highlight two of our publications. First of all, Latin American Economic Group, or LEO, as it's known by the acronym. This is the annual report on Latin America. It's published by the OECD, and it's received support from the CAF and CEPAL and the European Union. And the most recent edition talks about the green transition in Latin America and in the Caribbean. And it talks about cooperation mechanisms to help promote this. So it's a key publication that might be of interest for you. And I do have some summary documents here that with me for you to take if you're interested. And then the second point is the revenue statistics in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is put together with the help of many institutions in Latin America and covers almost all the Latin American economies and looks at taxation and fiscal structures and revenue structures. So this is all relevant to what we're discussing. Now, financing the green transition and this issue. We think it's one of the most complex challenges that we're going to tackle for three main reasons I'd like to set out for you. First of all, the sheer number of resources that will be needed to fund the transition. We can't know for sure how much we will need. There's this sentence that we keep hearing, from billions to trillions. It shows the kind of shift of the scale of the effort that we're being asked to make. And there's also a need for public and private partnership to work hand in hand, and also that inaction is not an option, not just for environmental reasons, but strictly economic reasons as well. And the dire impact of environmental ecological disaster, which would be have a devastating impact. Now, if we look at the decline in fossil fuel prices, that's going to have an impact on some economies that depend on this revenue, but also if we look at the infrastructure linked to fossil fuel extraction, those two can end up falling into disuse, and that's going to be a further cost factor as well that needs to be considered. Now, where can we find the resources to fund this transition? It can come from many sources, but let's begin with fiscal resources, taxation. And to give you some facts and figures about this, if you look at the tax revenue in Latin America, it's much lower than in Europe. We're seeing figures that are significantly lower, so around the 20% level in Latin America versus over 30% in the OECD countries. And that obviously has an impact. We need to make sure that taxes are, of course, regressive and equitable, and that the impact is balanced for the business as well. So we need to look at expanding the tax base, having tax reforms that will have the purpose of expanding the tax base. It deals with the problem of the informal economy and how we can include it, bring it into the fold of the taxed economy, but also deal with ensuring that taxation is regressive and that we can get revenue from those who have the most. who can make the biggest contribution. Now, if we look at the fossil fuels and the amount of effort going into extraction of these resources, that should be a major discussion in this debate as well. If you look at this figure, this graph, you'll see that some countries have up to 26% of their tax revenue coming from the sector. And in some cases, it's a key part of funding public policies and economic growth. And so there is not enough of a regressive taxation system in some cases. If you look at subsidies to fossil fuels, for example, that's a very telling point. It's a complex issue, it's a sensitive issue, but we think that it's a topic that needs to be discussed. So subsidies that are being applied across the board to all socioeconomic actors, and what it does is it promotes a polluting consumption model of consumption. So it's something that has to be put up for discussion. Now I can't talk about these. Also, there's tax evasion. That's a major factor, and once again, a source of lost income that could be used to pour into the green transition. Just a couple of points here. We're looking at environmental taxes. We have limited capacity for revenue to be gathered in Latin America compared to European countries. There's a clear spread here. And just coming back to what I said earlier, the potential drop in demand for fossil fuels, if we move forward in the green transition, then that's going to have a major impact on those countries that depend on the export of these resources. Let's think about, for example, the tax in revenue coming from non-renewable natural resources. In some member states, we're talking about 3% of the GDP. So that's a major share of the GDP that could be lost. And if you look at some countries where mining resources make up almost half percentage point of the overall GDP. So this is going to potentially have a significant impact, and we should prepare for an adapted taxation system. I'll skip over the next part a little bit so I can wrap up. What I want to say is that above and beyond the efforts that are being made by the public sector when it comes to designing tax policy, we also need to think about other sources of income to fund the transition. Development aid is, of course, ever more focused towards the just transition of the green transition, but so we've got support for investment programs, and I think we have to recognize the efforts being made by Global Gateway for here. But there's also the National Bank, multilateral development banks as well. They're going to be clearly very important channels for channeling investments in the right direction. And so when we talk about channeling private sector money, we need to think about financial instruments, green, social, sustainable instruments. And this is an agenda that we are determined to support. We have the new financial instruments and sustainability-linked bonds and new taxonomies and standards that are being developed so that we can really channel the resources towards the activities where they are needed, and so we can combat things like greenwashing more effectively. Just a few closing remarks to tie everything up and tie it in with a wider development agenda. In the Leo report, we say that the green transition should and indeed can be a driver for development in Latin America because of its position vis-a-vis natural resources, but also the young population and other reasons. We know that growth has been slowing, and when we look at the potential for growth, we can see that there's potential that's been not only been drifting away from developing countries, so we're seeing that the green transition can be a driver for boosting that potential for growth. Above and beyond growth, we need to make sure that we have a just transition, that we generate quality jobs, and that we create these jobs. And we have an estimate in our document where we say that if you aggregate 3 percentage points within the green sectors, then you can create more than 10% additional jobs in these cleaner sectors, for example, exports, sustainable mining exports, e-mobility, and other sectors. All of this can happen on the basis of good dialogue and consensus building, because the green transition can and will have a significant impact, and that can generate a lively debate. So on this note, I'd like to close, and I welcome any questions. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Vasquez, for your presentation. Now, to close, Mr. Del Blanco has the floor for 10 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Lo primero de todo.
Thank you very much indeed. First of all, of course, I too would like to thank you for the invitation to participate this morning. Some of the points which have been made by my colleague, I would normally have made myself, but I will skip them in the interest of time, and thank him for doing that. It's very important for us to realise how important environmental instruments are in investment, because we need to achieve the green transition. There are a number of instruments that we can look at to deliver greater sustainability, but I'm talking about fiscal sustainability as well as environmental sustainability. We need to spend tax money wisely. We need to collect it efficiently so that we can improve public services, so that we can enhance the prosperity of our citizens. That's effectively what government budgeting is about. So, having sketched out that backdrop, most of the member states, of course, do experience difficulties and challenges in achieving a green fiscal transition. This is inevitable because there are a number of major challenges and hurdles to be overcome. Traditionally, of course, they would have been the adverse effect on competitiveness, on industry, and perhaps on environmental investment. And as indeed some of the previous speakers have said, on the more vulnerable parts of or groups in society. And we need, of course, to remember that. Of course, environmental taxes can vary. Some of them can function as incentives to more green behaviour. Some can be designed differently, and we need always to bear in mind whether they're actually fit for purpose and are delivering the objective within the time frame that we have established. In the European Union, for example, there have been a number of difficulties in trying to agree on green tax because it's subject to unanimity in the Council. There are some countries which have managed to overcome these challenges more effectively and have actually been more effective in introducing green taxes. So it's worth trying to look at the design of these taxes. For example, environmental taxes have to be properly designed. The purpose has to be clear, and the incentives to change behaviour and to stop damaging the environment have to be clear. So detailed planning and careful structuring is very important. This has to be done in a general way, but also in terms of extremely great detail as to the implementation. In my country, for example, we have encountered some difficulties with implementation. We've had to do this over some considerable period of time. We are obviously giving industry and individuals a price signal that they need to change their behaviour over a period of time, but we can't do this too immediately because it takes time to change behaviour and to change investment patterns. In regional terms, what has been done in a number of countries is to try to achieve fiscal neutrality. So through increasing the green taxes percentage in overall tax take, other taxes can be adjusted. For example, income tax or certain taxes in the area of social policy. So we have to keep a close eye on the overall underlying trends and make sure that the income into the Treasury is constant and is reliable. So it is desirable to achieve the ecological green transition on an equitable, fair, inclusive basis. And this means we need to be careful about the mechanisms that we introduce, and certainly any kind of compensation that we might provide for vulnerable people, people with lower incomes, for example. It's very easy to talk about this in principle, but it's very difficult to implement it in principle because it depends on having, for example, excellent information systems, knowing what people's assets are, knowing how to classify the various companies and industry more widely, and knowing how to adjust the various levers. You need to do this carefully, otherwise you can unleash social conflict, as indeed we have seen. Having said that, there are a number of priority areas for action. First of all, sustainable electrification. Here, it's important to see whether you have an appropriate tax system, whether it's properly designed, whether it actually provides for the appropriate generation and distribution and consumption patterns of electricity. Greater green energy content is, of course, beneficial in terms of cutting CO2, but we have to look at the sustainability side of it too. We need to look for greener furniture, for greener arrangements in, for example, housing building, greener heating, greener cooling, and this is something that has to be factored into urban planning and house building. We can also introduce tax incentives in this area too. And the same can apply to refurbishment of older housing and building stock and older industry. CO2 emissions in transport are a major area that we need to tackle. From that point of view, the tax implications can be quite substantial. What can we do? Well, for example, if you look at the different types of energy that are used, you can ascertain what percentage of green benefit there is and whether there are any green taxes in place. If you look at Brazil, for example, there are taxes on renewable energy production, but the overall tax arrangements are being adjusted. You need to look at energy generation in relation to its pollution levels. And transport, for example, can be highly polluting. So this is something that we need to prioritize from a tax point of view, to impose taxes on agriculture, on the maritime sector, which are highly polluting. But you need to be careful how you do this, because as I've already indicated, you can unleash social unrest if you don't provide for appropriate compensation, and you need to avoid having social conflict. Otherwise, you will not have people on board with the green transition. In conclusion, I would just refer to another important policy area, which is the circular economy. There are many measures that have been put in place to deliver on this. Spain has been a priority, has been a pioneer in this, for example, in recycling plastic and in reusing plastic and deposit schemes. This is something where it sets a very high bar in European terms, and the tax is also very far-sighted. And this is something that could be replicated more widely in other countries, and it should be able to contribute to a more effective circular economy. Then, just in conclusion, we have to look at public taxes. You need to be able to cover your costs if you're going to have greener, more environmentally focused services. We need to provide water, for example. Use of water and taxation of water is an extremely important area for study. The environmental factors of providing such public sector services have to be factored into the overall cost and into the long-term planning in the sector. So one idea is to look at imposing some environmental taxes to enhance environmental sustainability, but also fiscal sustainability. And then the second point is that you need to look at establishing appropriate compensatory arrangements to facilitate a just transition, because otherwise there may be no green transition at all. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señor Del Blanco, también por su intervención.
Thank you very much, Mr. Del Blanco, for your statement and presentation. This concludes the round of first presentations from our experts and invited guests. This is now the time for us to open up the floor for debate. For the members present, please give us a sign. Please show if you are interested in speaking, and we will try and put together a list for the debate. Please, no more than 2 minutes per speaker. Please be very precise and focused in your comments. If I may, could we begin with the top table? And I give my colleague the floor. Thank you very much, and congratulations on those presentations. Thank you also to Ms. Lang for what you said, because we need to show people just how much is being invested in Global Gateway, because I think people in Europe need to know more about what's going on. People say that our trade and cooperation with Latin America will be a bad thing for climate change. But actually, the more we cooperate, the better the results will be, because we're not going to solve the world's problems in our little corner of Europe. So I think there's more we can do. A question to Mr. Vasquez. My Prime Minister from my own country said recently in the press that climate policy is more important than economic policy. Well, I don't quite agree, because I don't think you can have climate policy without economic policy. You can't really place the two in opposition. But this brings me to my question. How do you see this? How are we going to fund a sustainable transition? In Europe, some political parties would like to place many obstacles in the way. So, for example, let's give you an example, the deforestation regulation. Well, as the way I see it, this is going to help us to achieve an agreement with Mercosur countries. It's going to pave the way towards that agreement. And we see that the regulation is a challenge. It's a challenge to comply with the regulations. Yet, if we do have the agreement, then in the end, a lot will be possible. So what we need to do is we need to explain that in the regulation, there will be certain flexibility, technical assistance, financial assistance. All of this is included in the regulation, and the European Commission will be obliged to comply by it. So I wondered, how can we better promote the tools that we already have and put the regulations into practice? Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Hansen. Let's collect a few questions, and then we will have a round of replies from the experts. Let me give the floor to Ms. Povosta. Can I greet all the speakers? I have a question. It's not I'm clear whether it's for Olga or Christina, but when you think about Chile and the energy sector, that's about a quarter of the national greenhouse gas emissions. And hopefully we wish to be carbon neutral by 2050, before 2050. As Mr. Del Blanco said, then against that backdrop, there are 4 key axes. We need renewable energy, e-mobility, energy efficiency, green hydrogen. But all of those, on their own, trigger some kind of chain reaction, which all cause an increase in electrification. But we have a very sensitive issue here. It's to do with the transition, the energy transport and transmission lines. So how can we do this in respect of the indigenous populations, for example, with their rights? We know that non-conventional renewables are currently undergoing a crisis. 10% of energy produced by renewable plants cannot be fed into the grid. That's 10%. And for more than 2,000 hours annually, we're seeing renewables valued at zero in terms of the price. And that's to do with policies that were designed back in the 1980s, in 1982. And it was at a time that was very different. We have 3 non-conventional renewable plants that have actually left the grid, and more than 60 that are threatened with going out of business entirely. So we have a system, a regulatory system, but also a transmission system for electricity. That means that it's very difficult to actually ensure that renewable energy reaches households at an affordable price. So how can we deal with the grid system and ensure that we can tie in non-conventional renewables into that grid? Thank you.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. El siguiente.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Garona is the next speaker. Senator Garona from Chile. I'd like to talk about education on sustainability. Without energy, we won't have a green transition. Without mining and energy, we do need mining, we do need energy. And so mining needs to be responsible, and energy needs to be at the service of the problems we face. Copper and lithium are going to be key players here. Now, I think we've already heard about the issue of power lines in Chile, but we need to think about what's happening with the population. People are suffering because we know that there's major industry in Chile, non-government bodies, lawyers, activists, all of these bodies are trying to block projects to try and benefit local communities, benefit the NGOs, activists, and what have you. And the population are suffering at the hands of these interest groups. The population want the environment to be protected, yes, but they're not. It's not just about environmental sustainability. There's also economic development and human development. It's a triad of development. It's a trinity. And this is a mistake that we fall into. It's a trap we fall into, this radical environmental. What it does is paralyze development, and it means that we have this kind of stops us from having a just environmental green transition. So I'd like to ask what is being done when it comes to sustainability education, so that young people from an early age, in early childhood, primary, secondary school, can learn that sustainability isn't just about protecting the environment. Yes, it is also about that, but it's not only that. It's also economic development, but it's also human development. And I think in Latin America, in Chile specifically, there is a very strong focus on just protecting the environment without regard for everything else that also feeds into the idea of sustainable development. So education in environmentalism. What is the Development Bank actually doing in ensuring that people understand these concepts and that they don't become victims or become instrumentalized by this industry, this industrial scale activism that we're seeing, where projects take much, much longer to install. No, a power line used to take about 5 years to install. Now it takes 10 years to install. And that's a cost for the country. It's a cost for the energy grid, for the network. In the north of Chile, we see power cuts because there isn't the transmission capacity, and simply because of social conflicts. There's an undereducated population that's being instrumentalized, and this is a sort of one topic that's dominating everything, environmental protection.
Siempre sea posible, iremos alternando intervenciones.
Thank you. We will try to alternate speakers from the Latin American side and the European side as much as possible. Now, can I give the floor to Ms. Carvalho from the European side? Thank you very much. I'll be making my comments in Portuguese in my own language. If Ms. Carvalho could speak straight into the microphone, it's very difficult for the interpreters to hear. Thank you. Thank you. So I'd like to comment and also ask a question. We have a long tradition when it comes to cooperation in science with Latin American partners, also Brazil in particular, and the wider region. There's a strong tradition when it comes to combating climate change, and that's a major part of our negotiations. It's an ongoing theme. We had the Rio meeting that, of course, really represented the starting shot for environmental protection. We have cooperation. We need European programs to strengthen cooperation with Latin America and ensure that we include the whole of Latin America and Central America. We have to have scientific exchanges, knowledge exchange when it comes to climate change and clean energy. There's a great deal we can learn from one another. And so my question for our experts is, how can we intensify that cooperation and those exchanges that already exist? And we need to go further. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I'd now like to give the floor to Mr. Cunha.
Bom, Presidente, senhoras e senhores parlamentares.
President, Chairman, thank you, honourable members of Parliament. My greetings to one and all. The point I'd like to make today, the issue of green transition, energy transition, should not be the topic that we talk about in divisive terms and something that's it should be a public policy. We need a new model, a new way of doing things for our people. And so the question that I wish to raise here, if we move to this new shift in behaviors, this new model, then we have to have political policies that are going to be implemented in all of our countries. Yes. Right now in Brazil, for example, we've recently adopted a tax reform in the Chamber of Deputies, where we simplified the taxation system in Brazil, and we have a selective tax for certain acts, parts of the economy that cause negative health effects or degradation to the environment. So environmental costs. For those sectors, there is a selective tax. Now, however, what's still missing is the resources to fund a new model of behavior, the type of model that we want to promote in our countries. Yes, taxation is one source of revenue, that's true. But for the European Investment Bank, you talked about green bonds. So I wanted to ask you, how can we make sure that we can roll out more of these green bonds so that we can speed up the transition in the sectors of transport, agriculture, environmental protection? And if we emit green bonds, then will this be something that can be replicated on a global level to fund big projects as well? Thank you.
Thank you. I do need to urge you, please, to stick to your speaking time of 2 minutes, because we've still got a lot of people who'd like to contribute to the debate. We've only got about half an hour left, and we obviously do want to give the floor back to our experts to respond to the questions and comments. So please stick to the 2 minutes max. With that admonition, Marc-Angel is the next speaker.
Very much, President. I want to make a few remarks and then a question also. I think the debate we have here is very positive because we're having a positive narrative about the green transition, and this is very important because there are political forces who want to divide our society with this. And we all agree also that business as usual, this approach is no longer possible and that we have to act. And I think it's also important that we agree here that the just transition is not a crisis, but it's an opportunity to shape and to redesign how we live. And I think this is an important message which you always have to repeat. And here we as politicians have a big responsibility because we cannot leave it to the market forces alone. We have to intervene. We have to intervene, and we have to really, this intervention has to go hand in hand with social partners and also the workers. We shouldn't forget the workers in industries to take them along. And here I want to really tell you that IndustriAll is a European network of industry workers, a trade union, and they are really having a wonderful policy to convince and to how to bring workers on board into that green transition. So these interventions which we have to do, they of course need resources, and there's private investment and public investment is needed. And public investment, here we come to the question of our fiscal capacity. In the European Union we have a debate of own resources, but I wanted to put a question, or a concrete question. We produced as EuroLat a wonderful document, 8-page document, which we sent to the CELAC summit of our ideas, and we mentioned in paragraph 46 that we emphasize the need to establish at G20 level an international tax system to put an end to tax evasion and avoidance, corruption and tax fraud, and work towards fair and efficient tax harmonization at international level. This was a very good paragraph, but when I look at the conclusions of the CELAC accounts, the word taxation is mentioned one time in a bit of a different context. There is nothing about this on the CELAC, so are you also disappointed about, maybe to Mr. Vasquez or the others can comment on this, why do you think, is this not a subject, or is this not, can we not agree on moving together and doing something as like-minded partners on this important question? Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you very much, Vice President Angel. The next speaker is our colleague Prieto.
¿Había pedido la palabra?
Did you wish the floor? I thought you did.
Sí, está en la lista, pero yo tenía también usted en la lista, ¿no?
I had your name on the list as well, I thought. No? Okay, fine. In that case, my apologies. I've made a mistake with the list of speakers. So the next speaker would be our colleague Pereira.
Bueno, muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman. And thank you, of course, to the experts who are here this morning to share their expertise with us. It's been extremely interesting. And this is a very interesting exchange of views. I hope that everybody can hear me okay, that I've got the microphone in a suitable place. Of course, it's very important for us to talk about how we work together, particularly with the people who are suffering most from climate change. We've talked about a lot of sectors where we need to make change, and we've talked about vulnerable people, but there are some very vulnerable communities and provinces and regions in our countries. We know that already. We've seen what's happening in Africa, for example, and you can see what's happening in Latin America. So there's some very, very vulnerable communities and regions, and there's great inequality. The climate change issue is, of course, not felt equally across societies, nor within society, because, for example, women can often feel the impact more greatly. They're often the people who've had to deal more in the first instance with the implications of climate change. They've often got to go miles, for example, to get water in regions which are very adversely affected by lack of drinking water, as the Senator has so correctly said. It was very illustrative, her comment. So I have a few questions I would like to ask. First of all, to Ms. Lang. It was very interesting to hear about the projects that are being discussed, to the finance that will be put in place to tackle climate change. Now, to what extent will local governments be involved, or NGOs? Will it purely be something that operates at national government level? And what sort of information channels exist so that local and regional authorities are aware of the discussions and the plans? Obviously, these are all very complex topics, and we therefore need to ensure that we engage with all the people who are most particularly affected by climate change, that is, and how we can actually bring people on board so that they can contribute effectively themselves. Thank you very much. The next speaker is Ms. Pilar de Castillo, MEP. Thank you. So I think that there are a number of additional factors that we need to incorporate here. Normally, we would automatically be factoring in consideration of, for example, digitalization. So what role can the digital economy play in climate change policies? The two are intimately linked. We need to ensure that we look at energy policy through the prism of the contribution that the digital sphere can actually make in enhancing efficiency of energy consumption. There's a lot of potential out there. And I think that digitalization must be harnessed in order to ensure that we do use energy in the most efficient way possible. There are obviously very many aspects to this, but they must be carefully analysed because they can make a very important contribution towards decarbonising industry and the service sector too. Indeed, the digitalization initiative, the digitalization agenda, can probably make a contribution throughout the entirety of society and the whole panoply of climate change mitigation policies. So this needs to be factored into legislative initiatives. Obviously, we're from the European Parliament, my colleagues and I. You are from the Latin American parliaments, and we need to ensure that we liaise closely with industry in the policy initiatives that we introduce. All individuals have got to be aware of the impact of climate policy and the need for it. We've also got to realise how interconnected society is. Every farmer, for example, will have tractors and will have a whole lot of instruments that they can use or they could be using to calibrate irrigation. They will have a number of machines that they use. They could calibrate the energy consumption, and they should be able to ask a manufacturer, for example, for the energy efficiency performance of all the machinery and apparatus that they're using. And 80% of industrial data that's generated isn't actually used, according to the European Commission, in any event. So here, innovation could be considerable, and the management of the production chain could be enhanced considerably. So I think that if we can manage this data properly, we could actually have an effect on efficiency of our climate change policies, not least in the world of farming, but of course more widely too. We can also use digitalization in transport and in health. It's really a cross-cutting policy area which should inform initiatives in every other area of policy making. So it's so important that we need to have this test in all policy making areas, but not least in relation to climate change. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Rivera Mendes, Ms. Verona, Mr. Bryson, and also Co-President Chinaya. I wonder whether I've omitted to mention anybody who wanted to speak.
De acuerdo. Entonces,
Okay, once again, I need to urge you to be brief because we do want to hear replies from our experts and we will be running short of time. So the next speaker is the Member of Parliament, Rivera Mendes. Thank you very much indeed. It's my great pleasure to be here. Greetings to the whole audience. We need to see more support for Central America. Central America produces less than 5% of the carbon emissions of the planet, but it's one of the most vulnerable regions and one of the regions which is most greatly affected. So it's really important that attention is devoted to our protected areas, our wetlands, our forests, and that we are given support to contribute towards mitigation and adaptation in climate change. So we have a number of valuable projects in place already, different ones in different countries, and they need to be developed. In El Salvador, thanks to the vision of the president, we are actually renewing the whole energy network, and we are establishing a system which will be more respectful of the environment and take more account of it. And as the President's correctly said, education and awareness raising in school-age children is very important. Young people and children need to be committed to protecting the environment, and that's exactly what we're doing at school level already. 25% of our energy consumption in El Salvador is already geothermal, and therefore we're making more and more progress towards moving away definitively from fossil fuels. It's extremely important to underline that the transition towards a more sustainable society isn't something we can achieve overnight, and it's not easy. It's a constant battle, and it requires commitment, but our governments in Latin America and Central America are taking it exceptionally seriously, and they are making that commitment and effort, but we need every ally and support that we can get because we have one planet. Climate change is affecting all of us, albeit in different ways, and we need to come together and work together for a better planet. Thank you.
gracias.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Euro MP, Mr. Gonzalez. Thank you very much indeed. The speed at which climate change is taking place is, of course, different across the various continents, and we are all aware of this. I think that I would be the first to say that the regions and the different countries have obviously got to adapt and implement the environmental transition at their own pace, in their own way, and suited to their own circumstances. But whether we focus more on fiscal instruments or what else we can do to improve our efforts in line with Paris is something we still need to discuss. In any event, we need to up our efforts. We need to have better interconnectors across the regions, and it's really important, as many speakers have said, that we focus on green bonds and green credits, which is something that we can enhance by using carbon offset arrangements, whilst of course being vigilant against fraud and greenwashing. So we need to drive forward investment in mitigation and adaptation as a priority. And then the energy price crisis, which has affected many regions, has of course had a social dimension, a social impact to it. Part of the market, of course, has been effectively in an emergency situation, and we've had to address that. So Mr. Vasquez from the OECD and Mr. Blanco, I would be interested to hear what sort of solutions you'd be advocating to try to relieve the burden on citizens when energy prices go through the roof. I feel that we need to be in a better situation in the future if such a situation were to recur, that it wouldn't be the citizens who had to pay the price. So what sort of instruments could you envisage? Thank you very much indeed. I think that I can close the list at this point, and we will simply give the floor to the remaining speakers on the list, and I would urge you to be exceptionally brief, please. Our colleague Verona. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you for the invitation. I'm aware you may not have time to answer all the questions that we have, but we in Uruguay are experiencing the worst drought in the history of the country. We have problems with drinking water because our country is not really well prepared to deal with problems in the water flow from the Plate River. The digital and the green transition is going to be difficult for us because we are short of water in our aquifers and in our rivers at the moment, and we foresee that this could continue. So can you tell us how you would actually be proposing to deal with green hydrogen proposals and projects if there's a shortage of fresh water, and how you're going to combine the need to have water for industrial purposes with the need to have drinking water for populations in areas of drought? The next speaker is our colleague Raiso.
Gracias, senadores.
Senators, thank you.
Some attention to the smaller countries, especially within the Caribbean region. Myself, coming from a small Caribbean country of 60,000 population and 37 square miles, in the context of climate change, we are sometimes, or at least of our population, feel as the victims of climate change. In 2017, we were devastated with a hurricane that to this day, we are still recovering from. Many other Caribbean small islands also experience this, as well as Central American countries. And for that reason, my question would be maybe perhaps to the representatives of the EIB, for example, how exactly does loans help small countries especially in making this sort of transition when we are already taking loans in order to recover from the damage that climate change causes, that the recovery from hurricane, dealing with the rising sea levels, and then we're kind of told, well, there's options to be able to, for example, introduce environmental taxes on our population or go to the EIB for loans. I really would like to ask if consideration is being taken for the smaller countries that are deeply affected every day, worse and worse, as a result of climate change, and that options are given to them for grants, technical support, and that is, I believe, the direction we have to go, because we cannot sustain any more loans in order to deal with climate change.
Thank you very much. El siguiente diputado a hablar es el diputado Aita.
Mr. Gaita is the next speaker.
Buenos días. Gracias, copresidente.
Thank you very much indeed, Co-President, and my greetings to the Assembly. I'll try to stick to my speaking time as much as possible. We've stressed in our country that protection of natural resources is a state policy, not just in terms of policy making, but also when it comes to sustainability and ensuring that the political system is sustainable in its approach in the long term, and that we have social participation backing. And it's in that way that we consider sustainability. And that's how we want to make our public policies as effective. When it comes to this transition, this green transition, we do believe that we have to go beyond the confines of states. Let me try and explain my position. Quite often, policies that make it possible for to attract investment. We heard, for example, if we look at the difference in GDP between the Latin American countries and other countries, sometimes it means that we get investment. It's not necessarily a good reason, but I do recognize it's the case. And so I think what we do need is policies, state policies, that go beyond the national level, and that we have international policies that are sustainable in time and backed by social participation. Thank you.
Gracias, diputado. Tiene la palabra el diputado de San Blanc Cañadas.
Mr. San Blanc Cañadas. I'm from Ecuador, and I've know that a number of topics have been raised today, and some that affect us specifically in Latin America mainly is corruption. So my question is, what's being done? And this relates to what Mr. Hansen was saying. What's being done in Europe to track all these bonds and environmental bonds that come from international multilateral banks to ensure that the resources that are being channeled into, for example, water treatment plants, that we can see all the money reaching the destination. The Galapagos Islands in my country, for example. Let me give you this example. It's a UNESCO-protected landscape. There's no water treatment plant there. It's one of the most visited places, one of the most places that attracts tourists thanks to the work of Charles Darwin. Well, there's just no water treatment. Everything's just pumped into the sea. And there's no proper waste treatment facility there. Right now, in my country, we're seeing a political referendum to see what's going on with the lack of trust in the state, because when it comes to oil exploration, and we're still looking at trying to track down new oil resources because we're a poor population. So what can the international bodies do, international banks do, to ensure that those resources are truly being used to fund the energy transition and environmental transition? Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to now give the floor to Co-President Chinaya. Well, I do believe that in a meeting such as ours, we should discuss the holding of another meeting. Just a week ago in the CELAC EU summit, more than 40 points were set out with key proposals. And right here, it makes sense that we each want to talk about the facts on the ground in our countries or general facts that apply to the world at large. Well, because of the diversity we have, precisely because of the diversity, we have to act. There is a sense of urgency now. And I think we're not quite fully aware of the urgency. Many people talk about the Amazon, and people talk about it the world over, but also in the Amazon itself. But if you look at the Amazon now, it's emitting more than carbon emissions than it's retaining, absorbing. Well, it's very relevant for the south of Brazil. In Brazil, we know that when it comes to the peripheral parts of the woodland, we've seen some reforestation efforts, and that's important because we've had deforestation. We need to have reforestation. In the case of Brazil, this is absolutely crucial. We have to have reforestation of the Amazon. And of course, before we do that, we need to put a stop to this ongoing deforestation. This year, we were able to bring about a 40% cut in illegal logging. Well, this preventive measures against cutting illegal logging, we know that this makes about 40% of all the damage that's being done in Brazil. Well, we have certain people who we know that there's water that's being evaporated in the sea, and that then falls as rainfall in the Amazon region. But we have these people who are capturing the water, 20 million liters every year, and then we know that about 60% of the waters of the Rio de la Plata riverbed are being diverted in this way by people in the region. So we know when Christine was talking about 600 projects or more, all of this is perfectly legitimate. I'll just pick up on what parliamentarian Mr. Perrone was saying. We have a very there may be a legitimate reason why you might want to carry water to another country, for example, to Uruguay. And I think we should have an agreement, perhaps, between the nations and the bank to establish a hierarchy of priorities so that we can understand what the priorities are. I'm not just talking about the Amazon, but in Europe as well. We know that in Europe we're seeing the fastest rise in warming. Ever since the 1980s, we're seeing in Europe that warming is twice as fast in Europe as it is elsewhere. So quite literally, we can't say that there's going to be any region in the world that will be spared the impacts. Since 2015, when we had the Paris Agreement, and it was established that the more developed countries amongst the European Union would contribute with $1 trillion. Well, that's what this title actually alludes to. How can we have the fiscal adjustments, fiscal policy to support green transition? In some developing countries, it's simply something they can't afford, even in developing countries. So just imagine what it's like for underdeveloped countries. And for 7 years, there wasn't a proper contribution. Now, I'm asking this, I'm phrasing this as a question. We need to ask ourselves what should or shouldn't be taxed. Can we do it now, or do we have to wait for a more aware and clued up generation to come in? Can't afford to lose so much time. The governments need to come together with a sense of urgency and identify all the priorities that exist in each part of the world, each corner of the planet. I don't think we need to wait and observe or watch what happens. We're already seeing rising temperatures. So I just wanted to add to what our presenters have already said and thank them once again for their presentations.
Muchas gracias también por su
Thank you also for your comments. I know that other parliamentarians have asked for the floor. I'm very sorry that I can't give them any speaking time right now. We are very much running short of time, and I'd like to very briefly, however, give the floor to the representative from the Economic and Social Committee. Just 1 minute, please, Mr. Puccio. Thank you, Co-President. Thank you, Co-Presidents. In just 1 minute. The IMPA representatives, Olga, talked about the global gateway, having to listen to civil society. I know that the representatives in EuroLat are doing this. I'd like to just stress this point for all aspects relating to the green transition. Some very good ideas sometimes bring about a loss of competitiveness, for example. As Mr. Del Blanco and Mr. Vázquez said, for example, some taxes in a regional level or national level cause relative lack of competitiveness. That's why we have to global measures. And this committee, which is meeting today, I think is the right place to try and convey the right list of priorities to the COP28. I think it makes sense for all of these ideas to be fed into the multilateral decision-making framework. Otherwise, we really will be struggling in terms of finding the right interlocutors. These green reforms, taxes, and approaches to dealing with the energy crisis, everything that's been suggested in the context of energy and food management, the flow of information, transparency, fight against speculation, all of these aspects are important. Also, digitalization. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Concluimos así la
Thank you very much. And this closes the round of comments. And we've had some interesting comments and questions. Now the challenge is to respond to all of this in just a few minutes. We have been granted an additional 5 minutes of interpretation, so we can go on with interpretation until 35 minutes past. If we go beyond that time, we will continue without interpretation. So may I ask our guest speakers to briefly respond to the points that have been raised.
Many topics that came up that I think I'll just highlight how we look at a project, because I think when we're talking about, you know, the issue that was raised of corruption, the issue that was raised of human rights, environmental. When we are looking at a project, let's say the issue of transmission lines, which we have financed in Argentina, we look, is it linked to a plan? You know, it's important that we don't look at projects in isolation, but how they fit in the entire plan. And this is something that, in the case of the green hydrogen in Chile, we are looking and discussing these issues. So we look at mainstreaming the digitalization aspect. Digitalization is in every type of project. It's in water, it's in the meters, it's in, you know, the transmission. All of this stuff does have a digital element. We look at the gender. How are people using it? Who is impacted, and how they can be taken into account. So the social and the environmental standards, it's all on our website. The issue of you know, how to avoid corruption, and there with procurement, we actually require them to show us the procurement process. We agree or we not, and if they haven't followed the rules with the EU standards, that they have to do it over again. And so we go through this process, which can create delays, but in the end, we're ensuring a certain level of standard. And in terms of water projects, we try to involve the people in the project. So we visited in Puerto Viejo a project which we co-financed with ACID. The EIB only finances 50% of a project, so we're always working with the other players in the market. And there, it was the women that they hired to do the surveys, and these women are now empowered. One other aspect that we look in the projects relates to, you know, other sources of revenue, be it grants, technical assistance. And I'm happy to see someone brought up the issue of the carbon markets. There, we recently put one of the EU member states in contact with one of our projects, waste projects, to see how they could generate carbon credits from these projects, and the European country was considering buying them. So we're trying to bring in other sources of revenue into the area. But the MRV, which is monitoring, reporting, and verification, that's important in any project. And when we talk about bonds, it's extremely important, the integrity, you know, so the issuance of green bonds, it needs to be accompanied by MRV that is really robust. And it could be that you have a project that is a very large project that has a bond issuance related to that. We've done that, the project bond initiative in Europe that we had. Or it could be a portfolio of projects. Having worked on the individual projects, you know, the issue of actual implementation, you need to make sure that the projects will actually be implemented and that you'll meet the expectations. Education. Jujuy Verde is just an example. You have a governor with an idea about transforming the state of Jujuy when it comes to sanitation and the treatment of solid waste. Their education is part of the whole program. You know, you see all over the state, you know, the Jujuy Verde is the logo everywhere, and with the schools, and it's mainstreamed into the projects. I'm available afterwards if you want to discuss, and I just want to close by just saying my condolences for the representative from Ecuador. We were very sad about the murder of the mayor of Manta, that we were working with him on a water project, so our condolences.
Thank you very much. Señora Gibert, Baus Gibert, por favor.
Sí, gracias.
Thank you very much. I'd like to give a more general response. Well, dialogue is, of course, a key element. I've said that, and I think it does help resolve many of the worries and concerns that have been raised. Dialogue allows us to take important decisions at the political level when it comes to, for example, the Chilean electricity grid, and then the agenda that's being discussed with the governments and has been discussed over 6 months is a list of priorities, and it's where the governments have said these projects respond to important policy objectives and will bring about transformative change for our societies when it comes to the green transition, but also the digital transition, which has been mentioned, and that they are inclusive. So I've been focusing on identifying everything that came under the green transition, but if you have the investment agenda, there's also a whole list of digital projects that are being supported in Latin American and Caribbean countries where they've decided to sign up to the program, and the key focus there was to focus on citizens. And through this digital alliance, we're going to support 2 Copernicus centers, one in Panama, one in Chile, where we're going to provide services that will help to resolve some of the issues of small islands in the Caribbean, and it's going to provide services that are basic services when it comes to disaster prevention, for example. Copernicus will provide data. It will provide data free of charge to the countries so that they can better develop sustainable farming, so they don't have forest degradation, so they can get a better handle on forest fires. And these are all things that are initiatives. But perhaps I can pick up on one the first MEP said. He said sometimes we can't see what's being done enough, and these very important projects are taking place invisibly. Now, the agenda also has projects at the national level. Many of these have been identified in bilateral talks, but also there are regional projects where they've been put together at the level of Equipe Europa. So at the European level, and there we'll be talking about with the development banks and cooperation bodies. These are projects where private investment may be difficult to mobilize. We have an initiative for the Amazon to protect forests. We have an initiative in Central America to help protect the Mesoamerican forests, and we are working hard on forest protection and fighting environmental degradation. We have projects that are specific for the Caribbean, because where there's a specific situation. One project, for example, looks at the sargassum problems, which have detrimental health effects for the population there. And we have to look at the maritime economy as well, and integrating with that, because that's key to distributing food, locally produced food. Of course, today we didn't have the time for an in-depth discussion, but all of these issues are interrelated. And I think we have to be able to identify priorities and promote dialogue. And all of this is extremely important. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vázquez.
¿Se me escucha? Sí. Muchas gracias, presidente. Y bueno, antes que nada agradecer por esta discusión.
President, thank you very much indeed for this very important discussion and debate. It's almost impossible for us to talk about all the questions in this time, so just a few general comments that I think do cover some of the points that have been raised. In the OECD, we see the green transition as a multi-dimensional, cross-cutting agenda, and I think that ties in with the person sitting right behind me. Transition, economic transition and green transition go hand in hand. We need to think about low economic growth potential. We need to think about green transition as being a driver for growth and environmental protection as well. When we talk multi-dimensional agenda, we're not only thinking about growth. We're talking about something that impacts on all areas of policy making and sectors. And we're talking about productive development and jobs, with social policies, so that we can also protect certain victims. We're talking about equality and the women in indigenous communities, for example. When we talk about international policy, international development and taxation, and I think that's a key element that the OECD is going to be looking at. Together with the G20, we're going to talk about taxation for the digital sector. We need to make sure that there's a minimum taxation globally, and the vast majority of countries are already supporting this initiative. And finally, we're talking about governance. We're talking about social dialogue and ensuring that we have these issues included in the national agendas, and so we can truly respond to the requests coming from the different countries. We're talking about a triple transition, not just a green transition. As Ms. Del Castillo was saying, we're talking about a social and economic transition as well. Thank you. Thank you very much. And at this point, we will continue without interpretation. I wish to thank the interpreters for their work and thank them for the additional time they've been able to give us, an additional 7 minutes. So we continue without interpretation now with Mr. Del Blanco.
Bueno, muchas gracias. La verdad es que todas las cuestiones han sido muy interesantes. Yo voy a centrarme básicamente en aquellas cuestiones que se acercan más en cierta medida, bueno, al perfil, ¿no?, de mi persona, para intentar contestar un poco lo más concreto posible. Bien, en relación con las situaciones de emergencia, crisis energéticas, cómo liberar estas situaciones, básicamente es fundamental lo que he comentado. Ya no caben, hay que evitar las medidas de alcance general y hay que tender hacia medidas concretas, hay que determinar los potenciales beneficiarios. Claro, para esto siempre tienes en primer lugar decidir cómo lo ataco, ¿no? Vía gasto directo, vía incentivo fiscal, vía impuesto negativo de renta. Esa es una primera cuestión que habrá que determinar en función de la situación que se trata de solventar. Por otro lado, también es verdad que es fundamental tener buenos sistemas de información. Si tú no las tienes, básicamente vas a establecer medidas de carácter más general, vas a simplificar el diseño, con lo cual va a ser menos óptimo, a diferencia de si buscas unas medidas más concretas y eficaces, cuyo diseño tiene que ser más específico y, por tanto, tiene que durar al más medio largo plazo, porque los costes de implementar una medida de ese diseño te van a provocar que tengan que ser medidas que sean a medio largo plazo. Bien, desde este punto de vista también se plantean cuestiones institucionales, ¿no? ¿Quién es la entidad o la institución que mejor fuente de información puede tener? Bueno, pues en el caso de España, dependiendo de, obviamente, la materia, pero la agencia tributaria, ¿no?, suele ser aquella que tiene unos datos de renta y patrimonio lo más sólidos posibles, pero cuando tú te planteas establecer medidas de compensación concretas, te das cuenta también que esas fuentes de información están recogidas los datos en base a unas determinadas finalidades específicas de la institución que los tiene, que en este caso es la gestión tributaria. Entonces, que no casa en cierta medida de manera adecuada con el diseño óptimo de una medida de gasto, incentivo fiscal, etcétera, etcétera. Con lo cual, todo eso tiene que atenerse, establecerse y una vez se tenga decidido, implementarse esas medidas para que cuando se tenga que tomar la decisión se pueda realizar de manera rápida en ese momento. Luego, muy brevemente, comparto la opinión que han señalado varios diputados en el sentido de que las políticas ambientales tienen que ser globales, en concreto la política fiscal. Es decir, estamos ante un problema global, como es el medio ambiente, y por tanto se tiene que atacar de manera global. Y la política fiscal, cuanto más global, más multilateral sean las medidas que se tomen, pues mejor será porque evitará, como he comentado también en la exposición, distorsiones y problemas entre distintos estados. Y evitaríamos un poco lo que podríamos llamar, entre comillas, entiéndame, competencia fiscal desleal entre los distintos estados. También es verdad que se pueden tomar a cabo por determinados países medidas unilaterales que permitan un cierto avance de esas medidas deseables multilaterales cuando hay un estancamiento de esas medidas unilaterales, pero lo ideal es lo ideal. Y ya por último, en cuanto a la digitalización, pues obviamente lo comparto plenamente. De hecho, cuanto más se avance la digitalización, por ejemplo, en el Internet de las Cosas, ya existen bastantes documentos en el ámbito de la literatura que ponen de manifiesto que tú vas a poder, al menos en el ámbito de la tributación, diseñar de manera mucho más óptima esos tributos o incentivos fiscales para poder atacar el daño que se pretende solucionar con esa medida. Y bueno, simplemente, pues ya está, nada más. Muchas gracias.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Concluimos así este debate. Lamento que no hayamos tenido más tiempo porque creo que ha sido un intercambio muy interesante y quiero agradecer especialmente otra vez a nuestros invitados por estar aquí, por participar en el debate y por sus interesantes aportaciones. Nos quedan un par de puntos del orden del día muy rápidamente y para el siguiente paso la palabra al copresidente Chiñaya.
Neste momento, como o presidente Jordi já disse, cumprimos com o objetivo do ponto de vista do tempo e creio que, pelo menos de forma positiva, fizemos o debate do tema. O que eu queria indagar é se há alguma pergunta, se há alguma proposta, se há algum tema que vocês queiram sugerir ou alguma proposta sobre esse debate também, vocês poderiam, qualquer um de nós, endereçarmos à secretaria. Me permita, presidente, eu queria fazer uma sugestão aqui, nossa, se for possível. Eu creio que nós devemos nos preparar para alguns eventos. Eu quero chamar a atenção para a 30ª COP, que vai acontecer no Brasil, no Pará. E ali tem um aspecto de pegar toda a região amazônica, mas o resto do mundo. Eu penso que essa comissão deveria se fazer presente. E daqui até lá, a gente fazer um programa de trabalho, que todo mundo aqui já sabia e acentuou da dificuldade de, numa reunião como essa, a gente conseguir apreender na sua exata dimensão aquilo que está sendo feito, inclusive. Porque não é possível, ninguém tem todas essas informações. Mas é isso, presidente, obrigado e um abraço a todos aí.
Muito obrigado. Sencillamente, antes de concluir, decir que la fecha y el lugar de la próxima reunión de esta comisión será anunciada debidamente, oportunamente por la Secretaría. Esperamos podernos reunir en Santo Domingo, en República Dominicana, durante la última semana de octubre y primera de noviembre. Muchas gracias a todos ustedes. ¿Hay una petición de intervención? Muy rápidamente, por favor.
Como propuesta para tocar en la próxima sesión, la importancia del cuidado y protección de las reservas ambientales a nivel latinoamericano y global y su relevancia para el equilibrio natural y mundial. Eso para ver si lo podemos tocar en las próximas sesiones.
Gracias. Si lo pueden pasar por escrito, por favor, al secretariado.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Diputada.
Copresidente, creo que sería muy importante que pudiéramos abordar también los temas de pobreza energética. No solo dedicarnos en los grandes temas de energías renovables, sino no perder de vista aquellas familias que hoy día no pueden acceder aún a la energía eléctrica. Pobreza energética creo que sería un buen tema para nuestros parlamentos.
Muchas gracias. Tenemos de esta forma dos propuestas muy interesantes. Por favor, también manden esta propuesta al secretariado y las tendremos en cuenta.
Presidente, una última.
Sí, adelante.
La posibilidad de incorporar el financiamiento del desarrollo de industrias verdes en América Latina.
Muy bien. También, por favor, hagan llegar esta petición al secretariado. tenemos 3 ya. En todo caso, pues ya debatiremos cómo proceder. Para finalizar, muchas gracias a todos ustedes. También quiero agradecer al secretariado, al equipo técnico, a todo el mundo y buena continuación de esta reunión de EuroLat. Gracias.